So just to be clear that I'm not Kate, but Kate is coming right after me. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a tremendous honor to be here this evening. I am quite grateful to the team from the German Design Council for this very kind invitation. And to kick off, I would like to start with a little bit of history. So to truly grasp the significance of designing identities in Africa, we must first recognize the historical context that has shaped the continent. I would hate to assume that we have a shared knowledge and understanding of the long legacy of imperialism in Africa. So allow me to begin by sharing a few salient grounding facts. Centuries of colonial activity, interruption, and forced globalization have had a profound impact on African cultures, resulting in a complex tapestry of narratives and identities. Indigenous African cultural expressions, their making processes, chains and skills of production, and the products themselves were intentionally and violently suppressed. They were stolen and hidden in museums and private collections all over the world, especially in the global north. It was declared illegal for their people to make, use, and trade in them as part of the intentional forced economic decimation of African communities. So much has thus been lost, forgotten, and erased from collective memory many years on. In 1884, not too far from here, one of the most violent robberies in the history of humanity took place. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany at the time, at the request of King Leopold II of Belgium, convened a conference in Berlin, inviting a total of 14 European countries to divide up Africa among themselves for their own gain and benefit. Arbitrary borders were drawn, and these newly formed states and their inhabitants were shared among European countries to take possession of African lands and force them to become colonies, to extract from African resources and forcibly subjugate African people. A decade later, in 1895, the United Kingdom declared rule over what it named the East African Protectorate, the Kenyan-Ugandan Railway, a symbol of colonial domination, extraction, and imperial success, was completed 6 years after, by 1901. A year later, in 1902, the British settlers, who were actively encouraged by imperialist policy and its apparatus, came by the invitation and encouragement of the government, subsidized and fully facilitated, to occupy the fertile lands, forming rulership via a legislative council soon after. By 1920, the East African Protectorate was renamed the Colony of Kenya. Let's take a break from that timeline of horror and look at something else for a moment. This here is an example of Kamba beadwork. The Akamba are a tribe from Kenya who are most well known for their basket weaving and woodwork. A lesser known fact about the Kamba is that they also had a history of beading. The case of the disappearance of Kamba beading makes a strong illustration of the ways that the erasure of cultural heritage and design histories took place. We had begun with the story of Otto von Bismarck in Berlin, but the true path into Africa of state machinery had been created by explorers, eager to discover what others had already been living. They were followed by anthropologists eager to document, research, and establish themselves as gatekeepers to these new lands. On the one hand, claiming to come in peace, and on the other, publishing viciously racist ethnographic papers and books. And then came the missionaries, frothing at the mouth to transform the so-called dark and primitive lands for their God. These seemingly harmless, Bible-wielding white men and women, essentially foot soldiers of the burgeoning colonial machinery, slowly and relentlessly demonized indigenous practices, knowledge systems, and all external expressions of the same. And so here, our two disparate story threads marry, and the intentions of Otto von Bismarck bore fruit. Per cultural practice, Kamba beaded jewelry would be developed on custom basis, and the patterns and colors would be determined after a consultation with the medicine man. But in the case of the Akamba people, the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England, set up in Kamba territory. So it was this, among other things, but this intersection of adornment and spirituality in the beadwork that concerned the missionaries. They labeled this as witchcraft and actively discouraged people from wearing or making this jewelry, offering access to mission schools, hospitals, and varied opportunities as incentive for the new converts as the economies changed. I'm sad to report that they were tragically successful. The Akamba people no longer wear these beaded adornments and haven't for centuries. The skill to make them was never passed down, so now Kamba beadwork can only be found and seen in museums, preserved behind glass away from their people. This is just one example of thousands of practices, beliefs, literacies, and value systems that were systemically erased by colonial states across the continent. Let us now talk about the work of repair, of return, of the ongoing anti-colonial work of reclamation of identity, which began with the direct resistance of our ancestors to colonial rule and continues to this day. Design has played a central role here in challenging stereotypes and centering the voices of African knowledge and artistry via platforms for authentic cultural truth and engagement. Design is reshaping narratives by showcasing richness and diversity of African cultures, breaking away from the colonially informed monolithic portrayals, and promoting a nuanced understanding of the continent's identities. By incorporating elements of traditional art, craft, expression, and symbolism, countless African designers, artists, and makers have succeeded in infusing contemporary aesthetics with a sense of belonging, heritage, and pride. 11 years ago, we founded the Nest Collective. What started out as an art space has grown to become a relentless effort of reclamation and reframing of Kenyanness, of Africanness, of Blackness, and of queerness. Through our multidisciplinary approach, we sought to foster dialogue, excitement, curiosity, hybridity, collaboration, and innovation across various creative fields. Our projects have spanned visual arts, film, music, fashion, community gathering, public installations, VR. I always say that I don't think we're rather restless artists because we're always quite eager to hop onto a new medium. And every couple of years, every 2 or 3 years, we always have this massive identity crisis and feel the need and the urgency to focus on a single medium. But for the moment, we're still hopping around. Our projects have spanned all the mediums and are all centered around telling African stories authentically and refuting preconceived notions by centering the full expression, dignity, and importance that history tried and failed to erase. At the heart of all our work, there exists a fundamental question, a what if or a why does, an ongoing reimagining of the pasts, presents, and futures of our Black African identities and the intersections of that with feminism, race, and sexuality. From the very beginning, there was one thing we knew that our work absolutely had to be, that no matter what, everything we did had to be beautiful. It's the one thing we've never compromised on. So yes, we absolutely go out of our way to design beautiful events, films, books, visuals, and sound, because to do so is to honor ourselves. It is to honor each other, and it is to honor our audiences. Beautiful portrayals of Africans will only happen if we do it ourselves, because everyone else made up and kept the false reasons to depict us as the opposite. Beautiful portrayals of Black people, magnificent and infinite, will only be done by those who are determined to see the truth as it is And this must start with us, here, or rather back at home, alongside the other countless artists working hard to erase colonial imaginations and build new realities. Oppressive structures, in order to achieve dominance, have always poisoned, demeaned, reduced, and tried to exterminate the fullness, the lived and expanding humanity of those they seek to oppress. They have weaponized everything from history to religion to the law to this end. Racism and white supremacy has done this with non-white folks, especially Black people, to justify colonial extraction and racist violence. Patriarchy has done this with everyone who isn't cisgendered heterosexual man. So when you're Black, African, and queer, just imagine the first bits of information that the world has for you about yourself and people like you. We've therefore worked incredibly hard to develop and grow fluency in our aesthetic language, which was our baseline design approach, that gives dignity through our work to ourselves and the diverse communities that we belong to. For instance, in 2014, we created what has come to be our most defining work. We had always been dissatisfied with a problematic and toxic lens through which African queer people were seen, always struggling, diseased, and in crisis. We knew for a fact there was infinite more to the communities and the lived experiences of the people as a whole. So over several months, we collected hundreds of stories from communities across the country, from people who identified as queer. The initial plan was to put these stories into a book and then share them with the communities from where we collected them from. But as we went around collecting these stories, some of them lent themselves to us very visually, so we decided to make a film, Stories of Our Lives. Even though the film remains banned back home for reasons with strong colonial roots, the one thing this film has done is depict that beyond the unending struggle and harm caused by resisting homophobic violence, queer Kenyans are, on top of all that, romantic, funny, and sassy, defiant, joyful, and whole. In 2017, we put out a fashion book called Not African Enough. And for us, this book was a moment to self-define and to push back against the persistent myth that as a continent, we have a singular fashion aesthetic, the theory of monolithic Ankara print or Dutch print, depending on how you refer to it. The same broad strokes that the explorers, missionaries, and colonizers used persist in books ambitiously purporting to cover African fashion while only referencing 5 or 6 countries. The usual suspects being South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and Morocco. This will then be used to make definitive and broad statements that Africa fashion is. However, to only look at 6 countries in a continent of 55 doesn't really give you a good sense of what's happening on the continent, which is why it's important that we begin to see all 55 countries, which can be challenging, understandably, but necessary. Because the universe is what it is and thoughts become things, I would revisit this thought about full representation on the continent 2 years later in 2019, when I got an email from Rennie Ramaka, who was curating the Gola Biennial in Sao Tome at the time, and she invited me to make a proposal. It was difficult to say no. So I traveled to Sao Tome to experience it and imagine my way through the possibilities of the presentation. And on the very last day on the island, on the way back to the airport, in their finest robes, The Children Shall Return was born. Part dawn ritual, part site-specific performance, part fashion intervention, but ultimately mediation. In their finest robes, The Children Shall Return sought to reconcile Africa and her children in the diaspora, attempting to unbind one of the deep guilts in our fragile relationships with each other, which is a subtle tension of our complicity in the slave trade. The shame of the people of the continent who were part of giving away abducting and stealing each other's children as part of this deplorable market. Can there ever be forgiveness between the descendants of the people who are part of profiting from the trade, those who are left behind, and the descendants of the lost children? Can the sea ever forgive us for using it to transport uprooted, unwilling souls away from everything they had ever known and loved? Can the land ever forgive us that it was made the enforced site for the spilling of blood and the looting of a people? Can the children and their descendants ever forgive us for the unimaginable horror they experienced on the slave ships and the centuries of violence that awaited them on the other side? Moving on to look at the work of other designers across the continent, and we can start by looking at the work of South Africa's Manxhosa by Laduma, as well as Nigeria's Lagos Space Program by Adeju Thompson. And if we look at Lagos Space Program in specific, we see a purposeful approach to revitalize African textile tradition and furthering of ancestral visual languages. In the case of LSP, or Lagos Space Program, Adeju's last collection was named This, which I will not try to read out, lest I butcher it. But this translates to, we greet attire before we greet its wearer. It starts off via its name by situating and acknowledging the importance of dress and dress practice among the Yoruba. Adeju, through their work, focuses on reimagining the textile traditions of the Yoruba in Nigeria, while also actively debunking the myth that queerness is somehow a Western concept. Many of Adeju's designs use adire, an indigo resist dyed textile, a key component of traditional cloth worn in West Africa by Yoruba people. The heritage textile is reimagined by Adeju in a modern context by applying the dye technique to knitwear. Adeju calls this reinvention post-adire. Moving on and looking at the work of furniture makers such as Saba Studio from Kenya, as well as Jomo Tariku from Ethiopia, we see a similar approach of taking cues from African cultures, heritage, and symbols. Saba Studios, who are based in Kenya out of the island called Lamu, they look to Swahili mashrabia, specifically those found in Lamu, to establish a motif language that is both rooted in the past while looking to the future to create a modern and authentically Swahili furniture offering, all while preserving indigenous artisanal skills. Photographers and image makers across the continent are also working tirelessly to capture, document, and present the vastness of African identities, whether it's artists like Guled Ahmed of Somali heritage, whose mesmerizing self-portraits explore the gaps that exist within formal language in the understanding and contextualization of gender expressions that exist outside of the binary. Their work deals with the notion of futurity and is heavily aimed at envisioning new and equitable aesthetic futures for the Horn of Africa. It does bear saying that while going deeper into a national level to understand African design is where we can begin now, countries themselves can and have been a limiting frame. Each African nation has many more language groups and ethnic communities who existed long before those arbitrary colonial borders were drawn. As such, no attempt to understand African design that references history will be complete or comprehensive if it only chooses the dominant designs and aesthetics that rise to the top. The truth is, as it's always been, about the beauty of Blackness and Africanness is deeper, richer, and more infinitely abundant than we can possibly imagine. There is therefore a long, long way to go and blessed journey of delicious and glorious discovery that even generations after us will be on for decades to come. In conclusion, designing identities in Africa is a multifaceted endeavor that encompasses cultural representation, sustainability, and social activism through the work of countless African designers who are straddling multiple timelines at any given time, we are honored to witness the transformative power of design in reclaiming agency, revitalizing cultural heritage, and redefining African identities on the global stage. Thank you.